Hey everyone! Tonight we're going on a wild, anachronistic journey back to the medieval courts of Europe, where the clatter of cutlery was often as potent as the clash of swords, and a king's dinner was rarely just about satisfying an appetite. Imagine, if you will, the flickering torchlight, the heavy tapestries, the murmur of 100 voices, all centered around a long, oaken table laden with glistening roasts, vibrant jellies, and towering pies. You're not just a guest, you're an observer, a silent phantom drifting through a world where every morsel, every sip, every placement of a goblet was a carefully orchestrated performance. You probably won't survive this deep dive into the surprisingly cutthroat world of medieval gastronomy, not without a stomach for some truly peculiar concoctions. Anyway, so, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Like and follow the channel to continue waiting for the next exciting parts. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a great hall, a vast cavern of stone and timber, the air thick with the scent of roasted meat, wood smoke, and something vaguely floral, perhaps from scattered rushes on the floor. Before you, a banquet unfolds, a spectacle of excess and calculated display. This isn't your average Sunday dinner. This is medieval power in its most palatable, yet potent form. Every dish brought forth by liveried servants, every elaborate centerpiece, is a deliberate choice, a piece of a grand, silent opera designed to impress, intimidate, and inform. You see a boar's head, complete with tusks and an apple in its mouth, carried in with ceremonial grandeur. This wasn't just a tasty main course, it was a potent symbol of the hunt, of the king's prowess and dominance over nature itself. Historians still argue whether the apple was purely decorative or held some deeper, forgotten symbolic meaning related to prosperity or rebirth. Think of it like a medieval Instagram feed, but instead of carefully filtered selfies, it's meticulously curated food porn, designed to broadcast the monarch's wealth, influence, and even their political intentions. You might notice, for instance, a pie baked in the shape of a castle, complete with battlements and turrets. This isn't just a quirky dessert. It could be a subtle boast of a recent military victory or a thinly veiled threat to a rival. The more extravagant, the more artistic, the more unbelievable the dish, the louder its message. It's like, look, I have enough resources to pay a chef to build a miniature edible fortress, while your peasants are probably gnawing on turnips. Fear me, it's an almost comedic level of flexing, if it weren't so utterly serious. A mainstream historical fact you'll observe these banquets were meticulously planned affairs, often with hundreds of courses served over several hours, sometimes even days. They weren't simply about eating, they were social events, political forums, and theatrical performances rolled into one. The king would often eat at a raised dais, elevated above his guests, further emphasizing his superior status. You'd never find him elbow to elbow with a minor baron, unless he was making a very specific and highly unusual point. Here's a quirky tidbit you might miss if you weren't paying close attention sometimes. A live bird or even small animals would be baked inside a pie, only to burst forth when the crust was cut, shocking and entertaining the guests. Imagine the squeals, the gasps. It was a medieval jump scare, a moment of startling theatricality designed to underscore the king's power over life itself, or at least over a very confused pigeon. It also just sounds like a chaotic mess to clean up. Honestly, like trying to catch a greased ferret in a dining hall after a few too many goblets of wine. So as you stand here watching the feast unfold, remember that you're not just seeing food. You're witnessing a masterclass in nonverbal communication, a culinary language where every dish, every ingredient, every presentation speaks volumes about the king's ambition, his alliances, and his absolute authority. It's a silent symphony of status, played out on a grand, edible stage. As the spectacle of the boar's head fades into the background, your attention is drawn to the vibrant hues and intoxicating aromas wafting from various dishes. You notice that a single small dish of saffron-infused rice glows like captured sunlight, a stark contrast to the more mundane, albeit plentiful in stews. This isn't just about taste, it's a silent, aromatic proclamation. In the medieval world, spices were the gold standard of luxury, the absolute pinnacle of exoticism. They didn't just jazz up bland food, they were a form of currency, a display of immense wealth, and a very public signal of a king's global reach. Imagine for a moment trying to get your hands on a pinch of cinnamon or a few peppercorns back then. No Amazon Prime, no quick trip to the grocery store. These ingredients traveled thousands of miles along dangerous trade routes, through the hands of countless merchants, each adding their cut. So, when you see a medieval king's table groaning under the weight of dishes heavily spiced with cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and especially saffron, you're not just looking at dinner. You're witnessing a flexing of economic muscle so profound it would make a modern-day billionaire blush. It's like, oh, you think your yacht is impressive? My food costs more than your entire fleet. A mainstream historical fact, the spice trade, was a primary driver of global exploration and conquest during this era. Empires rose and fell on the back of demand for these precious commodities. Venice, for example, became a powerhouse largely due to its control over European spice routes. So, a king flaunting his access to spices was essentially broadcasting his powerful trade alliances and his capacity to dominate distant markets. It was a culinary map of his geopolitical influence, all laid out on a trencher. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some medieval medical theories, based on the concept of humors, believed that spices weren't just for flavor, but had specific medicinal properties and could balance a person's internal humors. For example, ginger was considered hot and dry and might be used to counteract a cold and wet imbalance. This meant that the specific spices a king used might also subtly suggest his concern for his guests' health, or perhaps even his own robust constitution. It adds another layer to the message. Not only am I rich enough to afford these, but I also understand the complex science of making you feel less phlegmatic. Historians still argue whether the medical understanding of spices genuinely influenced their culinary use, or if it was simply a convenient justification for extravagant consumption. You might notice a particular dish, perhaps a swan, cooked with a thick, dark sauce. The intensity of that color and flavor often came from a peppercorn, which was so valuable it was sometimes used to pay rent or taxes. It was the original black gold of the kitchen. A table heavily laden with peppered dishes wasn't just spicy, it was a loud declaration of the king's vast financial resources and his ability to command the flow of wealth. It's a bit like someone today showing off a solid gold iPhone, completely unnecessary for its function, but absolutely screams I've got money to burn. So as you observe the royal feast, remember that every vibrant color, every pungent aroma, every exotic flavor emanating from those dishes carries a hidden message. It tells tales of distant lands, dangerous voyages, immense wealth, and strategic alliances. It's a language spoken silently, through the very palate, asserting the king's power not just over his subjects, but over the wider, interconnected world, and all from a simple sprinkle of something you probably have in your pantry right now. Moving along the grand table, past the aromatic haze of exotic spices, your gaze now falls upon the humbler, yet equally significant, array of beachy roundmates. You might assume bread is, well, just bread, but in the medieval court, it was a profound statement of social standing, a silent but unmistakable indicator of who you were, and more importantly, who you weren't. You see loaves ranging from pristine white to coarse, dark brown, and each shade tells a story, a culinary code of status and privilege. The king and his highest-ranking nobles would be served manchet bread, often referred to as Lord's bread. This was the equivalent of today's artisanal, hand-kneaded sourdough, but with far more significant social implications. Made from the finest, most meticulously sifted wheat flour, it was incredibly white, soft, and delicate. Achieving this level of whiteness was labor-intensive, requiring multiple sievings to remove every last speck of bran and germ. This process, of course, meant it was expensive, a luxury only the elite could afford. When you saw this bread on the table, you knew you were in the presence of someone truly important, someone whose digestion was apparently too delicate for anything less than pure, refined carbohydrates. It was a subtle, edible flex. My digestive system is as refined as my lineage. A mainstream historical fact, wheatun was the most prized grain, and therefore wheat bread was universally considered superior. The whiter the bread, the purer the wheat, and the higher the status of the person consuming it. In contrast, rye, barley, or oat breads were the staple for the common folk, often mixed with other grains or even legumes to make them go further. Serenic, while you're eyeing that crusty, perfectly white manchet, remember it's not just a tasty accompaniment, it's a social barrier, a line drawn in flour. Now, for a quirky tidbit about bread's hidden uses besides eating, bread also served as a trencher. Instead of plates, thick slices of stale bread, usually a coarser variety, were used to absorb the juices and gravies from the meat and other dishes. Once the meal was over, these saturated trenchers would either be given to the poor, fed to the dogs, or even, sometimes, eaten by the less privileged members of the household. So, the bread you ate, or the bread your food rested on, literally defined your place in the social hierarchy, from the king's pristine manshed to the trenchers underfoot. Historians still argue whether the practice of giving trenchers to the poor was genuine charity or primarily a convenient form of waste disposal that also served to project an image of benevolence. You might also observe the sheer variety in size and shape. Some loaves are small, individual rolls, clearly for singular consumption, signaling the individualized attention afforded to the elite. Others are massive, rustic rounds, hinting at communal consumption lower down the social ladder. The very act of portioning and serving bread also carried meaning. The king's bread would be meticulously cut and placed, while for others it might be roughly torn. It was a very quiet, yet constant, reinforcement of the pecking order. You wouldn't want to accidentally grab a slice from the king's pristine pile. That would be a serious faux pas, perhaps even a sign of disrespect. It's like, excuse me, peasant, those refined crumbs are for my mouth only. So, as you mentally nibble on the history presented before you, consider that the humble loaf of bread, often taken for granted in our modern world, was a complex symbol in the medieval court. It was a testament to the baker's skill, the kingdom's agricultural wealth, and most profoundly, an edible emblem of a person's birthright and standing within the rigid social structure of the age. Having deciphered the subtle hierarchy of bread, your senses are now assaulted by the rich aromas and visual grandeur of the meat dishes paraded before you. This is where medieval culinary messaging truly roared, for meat, especially certain kinds and preparations, was the ultimate declaration of power, wealth, and martial prowess. You see towering platters of venison, glistening roasts of beef, and even exotic birds like swans and peacocks, often redressed in their own plumage after cooking, creating a bizarre and opulent spectacle. The type of meat on a king's table was not accidental. Venison, for example, meat from deer, was strictly reserved for the nobility. Commoners were forbidden from hunting deer, which were considered the king's property, residing in his forests. So, a lavish spread of venison wasn't just delicious, it was a powerful reminder of the king's dominion over the land and his exclusive rights. It was a silent, fleshy, no trespassing sign, eloquently stating, "This is my forest, these are my deer, and this is my dinner." What's your peasant stew looking like? A mainstream historical fact. Beef was a staple. but the quality and cut varied drastically. While a peasant might get the tougher, older cuts, the king and his court would feast on the tenderest joints, often from younger animals specifically raised for the table. This distinction highlighted the king's ability to command not just the hunt, but also extensive agricultural resources and the labor required to raise such livestock. It reflected a deep control over the very fabric of the kingdom's economy. Now, Ricky, for a quirky tidbit, the most theatrical meat dishes where there were subtleties, or subtleties. These were elaborate, often allegorical, food sculptures made from various ingredients, often a mixture of cooked and ground meat, molded and then painted with food dyes. Imagine a roasted pig's head mounted on a platter, but adorned with a knight's helmet, or a scene depicting a recent battle entirely made of spiced meat pastes. These weren't just for eating, they were edible art, designed to tell a story, celebrate a victory, or even convey a political allegory. It's like a medieval meme, but one that took days to create and then you ate it. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of these subtleties was artistic expression, political propaganda, or simply to astound and entertain guests who had, frankly, seen it all. You'll notice the preparation itself carried weight. Whole roasted animals, especially impressive ones like one wild boar or a full mox on one, symbolized abundance and the king's ability to provide bountifully for his court. It's a primal message: I can feed an army, or at least a very hungry court. The sheer scale of such dishes projected an image of limitless resources and power. Even the birds on the table held meaning. Swans and peacocks, besides being aesthetically stunning when redressed in their feathers, were considered extremely luxurious and difficult to procure. Serving them was a declaration of extreme wealth and access, hinting at networks that extended far beyond the immediate locale. It's the medieval equivalent of having a private jet with a gold toilet, completely unnecessary, but undeniably impressive. So, as you take in this carnivorous display, remember that every cut, every creature, every elaborate presentation on the royal table was a carefully chosen piece of a larger puzzle. It was a silent, yet powerful narrative crafted to reinforce the king's absolute authority, his immense wealth, and his place at the very pinnacle of the medieval world. It was a feast, yes, but also a masterful lesson in edible dominance. Having navigated the opulent landscape of royal meats, your attention now shifts to a seemingly less glamorous, yet surprisingly significant part of the medieval table: their fruits and vegetables. You might dismiss them as mere accompaniments, but in this era, even a simple apple or a humble cabbage could carry layers of hidden meaning, speaking to health, seasonality, and even moral virtues. Unlike today, where exotic produce is flown in year-round, medieval availability was strictly dictated by the seasons and local harvests, making certain fruits and vegetables inherently valuable. Consider the wanton apple. While common enough, its presence on a noble table could symbolize fertility, knowledge, or even temptation, depending on the context. In illuminated manuscripts, you often see apples depicted in scenes of paradise or temptation, linking them to deeper theological concepts. A king offering an apple to a guest might be subtly extending a gesture of peace or sharing in a symbolic abundance. It wasn't just a snack, it was a bite of allegory. A mainstream historical fact, fresh produce, was often viewed with suspicion as it was thought to carry diseases or be difficult to digest. Cooked vegetables, often boiled into pottages or stews, were preferred. This meant that any raw fruit or vegetable presented at a royal feast was a statement of its pristine quality and the health of the consumer, subtly implying that the king's robust constitution could handle what lesser mortals could not. It's like, my immune system is so strong, I can eat raw kale. Can you? Now, for a quirky tidbit, certain vegetables held very specific symbolic meanings rooted in folklore or religious belief. Cabbage, for instance, while a common peasant food, sometimes appeared on noble tables, particularly in stews. Its numerous layers were occasionally interpreted as symbolizing complexity, or even the layers of society itself. And red onions and garlic, though prevalent, were often associated with the lower classes due to their strong odors and ease of cultivation. So, if you saw them prominently displayed, it might be a subtle nod to the king's connection to the common people, or perhaps a pragmatic acceptance of their culinary utility. Despite their less refined reputation, historians still argue whether these symbolic interpretations were widely understood by the general populace or primarily confined to educated elites. You'd also notice the seasonality of the produce. A midwinter feast featuring fresh berries or early spring greens would be a truly extraordinary display of a king's ability to either command distant trade routes for preserved or specially transported items, or, more likely, a boast of sophisticated horticultural practices within his own domain. Perhaps even heated greenhouses, if such luxuries existed. This wasn't just about enjoying a taste of summer in February. It was about showcasing control over nature itself, bending the seasons to the royal will. Even the way vegetables were presented mattered. Simple, rustic preparation might indicate humility or a connection to the land, while finely chopped, intricately arranged vegetables, if they appeared at all in such a manner, would speak to the chef's artistry and the expense of the labor involved. It's a very quiet form of communication, like a gardener subtly pruning a bush into a royal crest. So, as you observe the greenery and fruit amidst the roasted meats, remember that these seemingly innocent elements of the feast carried their own weight of meaning. They spoke of the seasons, of health, of prosperity, and even of the king's connection to the land and the people he ruled, adding nuanced layers to the silent, edible messages of the medieval court. With the last symbolic apple noted, your attention now shifts to the vessels brimming with liquids on the royal table. Far from being mere thirst quenchers, the drinks served in medieval courts, primarily wine and ale, were potent diplomatic tools and clear markers of status. You see various goblets, tankards, and flagons, each containing beverages that speak volumes about power, alliance, and the subtle art of negotiation. Nekorne nuantina, wine, especially, was a drink of distinction, favored by the nobility and clergy. The quality and origin of the wine revealed much about the king's wealth and trade connections. A rich, sweet wine imported from Gascony, for instance, spoke of valuable territories held or strong trade alliances with those regions. Serving such a wine was a quiet, potent affirmation of the king's economic and political reach. It's like pouring your guests a rare vintage from a vineyard you happen to own in a contested territory. A very smooth, yet very intoxicating display of dominance. The richer, the older, the more geographically distant the wine, the louder its message. A mainstream historical fact, the consumption of ale and beer, was far more widespread across all social classes than wine, often because water quality was unreliable. However, even within ales, there was a hierarchy. The royal household would consume stronger, clearer, and more finely brewed ales, sometimes flavored with expensive spices, while commoners drank weaker, cloudier brews. So, while everyone drank, what they drank, and its clarity, was a clear social indicator. You wouldn't catch a king sipping on some murky, lukewarm swill unless he was, perhaps, trying to connect with the common folk in a very deliberate, theatrical way, a bit like a modern politician shaking hands with a factory worker, only with more foam. Now, for a quirky tidbit, the practice of a toasting had deeper roots than simply celebrating. It was often a ritualized act of loyalty, alliance, or even a challenge. Drinking from the same cup or passing a cup around could signify unity and trust. Conversely, refusing a drink or being offered a distinctly inferior one could be a deliberate snub, a subtle declaration of displeasure or disdain. Imagine the tension as a challenging duke hesitates over a goblet of inferior ale while the king sips his finest Gascon wine. Historians still argue whether the elaborate rituals surrounding drinking were primarily about etiquette or if they served as a genuine means of detecting potential enemies or testing loyalty at the royal table. You might also observe the vessels themselves. The king would drink from an ornate goblet, perhaps made of silver or even gold, sometimes encrusted with jewels. These weren't just fancy cups. They were extensions of his regalia, symbols of his divine right and immeasurable wealth. To tut, let alone drink from, the king's personal goblet without permission would be an unthinkable act of transgression, possibly treasonous. It's like trying to take a sip from the president's personal, diamond-encrusted water bottle during a state dinner. Just don't. Furthermore, the act of pouring and serving drinks was often highly ritualized, with specific cupbearers or sommeliers, sometimes high-ranking individuals themselves, responsible for these tasks. Their very presence and the precision of their actions underscored the value of the liquid and the importance of the act of drinking within the courtly setting. It was a silent ballet of service, all designed to enhance the message of the king's grandeur. So, as you witness the clinking of goblets and the pouring of liquids, remember that these weren't just refreshments, they were conduits of power, instruments of diplomacy, and clear indicators of social standing. Every pour, every toast, and every vessel held a secret message, waiting to be deciphered by those astute enough to read the liquid language of the medieval court. Having observed the silent declarations made by medieval libations, your gaze now sweeps across the broad, polished surface of the table itself. You realize that beyond the food and drink, the very table settings, the arrangement of trenchers, the placement of salt cellars, the presence or absence of cutlery formed a visual alphabet, a complex code of etiquette and status that spoke volumes without a single word. You are stepping into a world where a misplaced napkin could be a social catastrophe. At the highest echelons, near the king, you might see individual salt cellars for each esteemed guest, perhaps exquisitely crafted from precious metals. Salt, historically, was a valuable commodity, crucial for preserving food, and thus access to it symbolized wealth and power. To be placed above the salt was a literal and figurative mark of honor, indicating your elevated status. Guests below the salt were of lesser rank, enduring coarser conditions and perhaps sharing a single, humble salt dish among many. It was a clear, unyielding line drawn in crystals, separating the elite from the merely important. A mainstream historical fact: personal forks were a relative rarity in medieval Europe, only gradually gaining acceptance towards the end of the period, primarily in Italy before spreading elsewhere. Most people ate with knives which they carried themselves for hunting, defense, and dining in their fingers. So, if you spotted a fork on a noble's table, especially an ornate one, it wasn't just a quirky utensil, it was a sign of extreme sophistication, adopting cutting-edge pun-intended foreign customs. It was a subtle, almost whispered boast of being fashion-forward and well-traveled. Now, for a quirky tidbit, the precise folding and placement of tourney napkins, if they existed at all in a recognizable form for common use, could also carry meaning. While not as elaborate as later eras, any form of linen on the table, beyond the bare wood or rush matting, was a mark of luxury. Furthermore, the presence of a voiding table nearby, where empty trenchers and waste could be placed discreetly, indicated a high level of organization and concern for presentation. Again, reflective of a very well-managed, wealthy household. Historians still argue whether the complexity of medieval table etiquette was primarily for practical hygiene, for display, or as a deliberate social barrier to exclude the uninitiated. You might also notice the absence of certain modern conveniences. Individual plates, as we know them, were uncommon, as we discussed. Trenchers of bread or even wooden platters were the norm. The quality of these trenchers, whether fresh, fine bread for the elite, or stale, coarse bread for others, reinforced social distinctions. The very act of sharing a common platter, while seemingly egalitarian, often had implicit rules about who took what and when, ensuring the highest-ranking individuals received the choicest cuts. Even the way serving dishes were brought out, and in what order, was a choreographed sequence. The most impressive dishes, the subtleties or the redressed birds, would be paraded with great pomp and ceremony, ensuring all eyes were on the king's grandeur. It was less about efficient serving and more about dramatic effect, turning the meal into a prolonged theatrical event. So, as you observe the seemingly static elements on the table, remember that they are anything but. Every piece, from the gleaming salt cellar to the humble wooden spoon, is part of an intricate, unspoken language of status, tradition, and power. It's a silent orchestration of social order, meticulously laid out for all to see, and for you, dear listener, to decipher. As the intricate tableau of table settings silently conveys status, your gaze naturally drifts beyond the diners to the figures flitting around them, the servers. In the medieval court, these individuals were far more than mere food runners. They were integral to the subtle communication network, unseen messengers who could, through their actions, reinforce or even undermine the carefully constructed messages of the feast. You are watching a silent ballet of service, where every bow, every pour, and every retrieval carries an implicit meaning. The sheer number of servants present at a royal banquet was, in itself, a message. A king with a vast retinue of liveried attendants demonstrated immense wealth and power, the capacity to support a large, non-productive workforce. It was a visual testament to his resources. Look at all these people I employ just to bring me my pheasant. What do you have a single scullery maid? The more numerous and more elaborately dressed the servants, the louder the message of royal grandeur. A mainstream historical fact, the roles of servants at a medieval feast were highly specialized and often hereditary. There were pantlers for bread, butlers for wine, carvers for meat, and even ewerers for washing hands. Each had specific duties and a precise order of precedence. This rigid hierarchy among the servants mirrored the hierarchy of the court itself, creating a microcosm of the kingdom's social order playing out around the dinner table. Their synchronized movements were a testament to the king's organizational prowess. Now, for a quirky tidbit, the practice of orising was a crucial, if nerve-wracking, duty for certain high-ranking servants. Before the king ate or drank, an appointed individual, often the assayer or a designated taster, would sample each dish and drink to ensure it wasn't poison. This wasn't just a practical precaution, it was a public display of the king's vulnerability and the trust he placed in his loyal servants, subtly emphasizing the ever-present threat of betrayal even amidst luxury. Imagine the job interview. So, you'll be dealing with food and possibly death. Benefits include not dying. Today, historians still argue whether the frequency of actual poisoning attempts justified the elaborate assaying rituals or if they were largely a performative display to underscore the king's importance and the danger he lived with. You would notice the precise etiquette of their movements. Servants would approach the high table with profound bows, moving with a controlled grace that spoke of discipline and respect. A slow, deliberate presentation of a dish could emphasize its importance, while a quick, almost dismissive placement might signal a dish of lesser significance. Even the direction they approach the table from, or which side they serve from, could be governed by specific, unwritten rules. Consider the act of carving. Near, often, a highly skilled and trusted individual, sometimes a noble himself, would perform the carving of the meats at the high table. This wasn't just about slicing. It was a performance of skill and a demonstration of the king's trust in that individual. A clumsy carver might subtly imply a lack of control in the household, while a master carver added another layer of refinement to the overall spectacle. So, as you observe the silent, diligent movements of the servants, remember that they are not mere background figures. They are active participants in the culinary narrative of the medieval court, their every action, every gesture, adding nuance and depth to the king's silent, edible messages of power, wealth, and security. They are the stagehands in this grand gastronomic theater, With the silent choreography of the servers still fresh in your mind, your thoughts are inevitably drawn to the very heart of the royal feast, the kitchen. But this is no ordinary kitchen, and the individuals laboring within are far more than mere cooks. These are the royal chefs, culinary alchemists and, often, unwitting spy masters, crafting dishes with hidden intentions, their creations serving as the king's edible diplomacy. You are now peeking behind the magnificent curtain into a realm of immense heat, controlled chaos, and profound influence. Imagine the sheer scale, vast ovens, cauldrons bubbling over roaring fires, tables laden with butchered meats, and mountains of vegetables. The royal kitchen was a colossal operation, often employing dozens, even hundreds, of individuals, from master chefs to scullery maids. The ability to maintain such a complex, well-oiled machine was in itself a testament to the king's organizational genius and boundless resources. It's like running a Michelin-starred restaurant, a logistical marvel, but with the added pressure of potentially influencing international relations with a particularly well-seasoned pheasant. A mainstream historical fact, medieval royal kitchens were often separate buildings or extensive wings, built to contain the fire risk and accommodate the enormous scale of food preparation. They were equipped with specialized tools, from massive spits for roasting entire animals to intricate molds for shaping subtleties. The head chef, often known as the master cook, held a position of significant authority within the household, frequently commanding a large staff and overseeing vast budgets. Their skill was not just in cooking, but in managing a complex industrial enterprise. Now, for a quirky tidbit beyond the physical labor, royal chefs were privy to a remarkable amount of courtly gossip and sensitive information. Imagine the hushed conversations among servants coming to collect dishes, or the whispers carried on the steam from the pots. A chef, discreetly listening while preparing a king's favorite stew, could gather invaluable intelligence. They also held immense power over the king's diet, potentially influencing his mood, health, and even his susceptibility to illness. A chef could, intentionally or not, subtly influence affairs of state by merely choosing a richer sauce or a lighter soup. Historians still argue whether chefs actively engaged in espionage or if their proximity to power simply made them inadvertent repositories of sensitive information, sometimes used by others. You might notice the emphasis on presentation over mere sustenance. While taste was important, the visual impact of a dish was paramount. Chefs were artists, not just cooks, sculpting jellies into heraldic beasts, coloring sauces with vibrant, expensive pigments like saffron or madder root, and devising mechanical contrivances to make peacocks fly or fountains flow at the banquet table. Their creations were designed to amaze, to symbolize the king's grandeur, and to make guests whisper in awe. It was a culinary arms race of spectacle, each court trying to outdo the last. Even the ingredients themselves could be a form of coded message. A chef might be instructed to subtly increase the amount of a rare, expensive spice in a dish intended for a particular visiting dignitary, a discreet gesture of profound respect and generosity. Conversely, a reduction in quality or quantity for a disfavored guest would be an equally clear, if unspoken, slight. The chef was the orchestrator of these subtle gastronomic negotiations. So, as you breathe in the mingled aromas of spices and roasting meat from the royal kitchen, remember that you are in the workshop of culinary power. The royal chefs, with their skill, their artistry, and their privileged position, were crafting more than just meals. They were preparing edible missives, silent communiques that helped shape the very destiny of the kingdom. Stepping out of the bustling, steamy kitchen, your focus returns to the dining hall, where another layer of control, less about the food itself and more about who was allowed to eat what, comes into sharp relief. You are now observing the invisible, yet ironclad, rules of sumptuary laws, the medieval equivalent of a very strict dress code. But for your dinner plate, these laws dictated not just what clothing you could wear, but also what foods you could consume, all based on your social standing. Imagine a guest, perhaps a wealthy merchant, eyeing the king's table laden with venison and swans. A sumptuary law would explicitly forbid him from serving such luxuries in his own home, or even consuming them publicly without severe penalty. These laws weren't just about curbing extravagance. They were powerful instruments of social control, designed to maintain the rigid hierarchy of medieval society. They ensured that the visible symbols of wealth and power, like rare foods, remained exclusive to the elite. It's like the government telling you, sorry, that fancy truffle pasta, that's only for dukes. You, sir, must stick to your peasant gruel, regardless of your bank balance. A mainstream historical fact sumptuary laws were widespread across medieval Europe, varying from region to region and changing over time. They aimed to prevent social mobility from blurring class distinctions, particularly as a burgeoning merchant class gained wealth. By controlling consumption, kings sought to prevent new money from mimicking the aristocracy, thus preserving the traditional social order. These laws literally put a price on your dinner plate, based on your birthright. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some sumptuary laws even extended to the number of courses allowed at a meal for different social strata. A knight, for instance, might be limited to 2 meat dishes and a dessert, while a baron could have 4. This wasn't just about limiting gluttony. It was a visible manifestation of power and privilege. A king's feast, by contrast, would be virtually unlimited, serving as the ultimate demonstration of his unchecked power to consume. Literally and figuratively, it's like, my buffet has no end, but yours ends at the soup station. Know your place. Historians still argue whether these laws were primarily driven by economic control, moral outrage at excess, or simply a deep-seated desire by the nobility to maintain their visible superiority. You would notice the visible consequences of these laws. While the royal table shimmered with exotic game and imported wines, the tables further down the hall, for lesser nobles or officials, would display a more restricted, albeit still plentiful, spread. The difference was stark, a constant reminder of each individual's place within the societal pyramid. It was a culinary caste system, enforced by royal decree. Even the types of fish consumed could be subject to sumptuary laws, especially during lean periods or religious observances. While commoners might eat herring or cod, the king and high nobility might feast on salmon, sturgeon, or lampreys, again showcasing their access to the most desirable and often expensive aquatic fare. The distinction extended to every aspect of the meal. So, as you mentally peruse the various dishes, remember that what you saw on each plate wasn't just a matter of taste or availability, but a meticulously enforced regulation. Sumptuary laws made food a powerful tool for social control, ensuring that the king's table remained an undeniable beacon of his unparalleled status, while subtly reminding everyone else of their rigidly defined place within the medieval world. It was a quiet, constant declaration of who ruled and who merely served. With the sumptuary laws casting their invisible net over the entire hall, your attention is drawn to a particularly critical aspect of the medieval banquet's messaging: guest seating. This wasn't a casual affair of first come, first served, or picking your friends. No, the arrangement of guests at the royal table was a meticulously calculated act, a silent, powerful pronouncement of influence, favor, and rank. Your proximity to the king was a direct measure of your importance, and everyone in the hall understood this unspoken hierarchy. Imagine the tension as guests entered the hall, subtly scanning the seating arrangements, trying to decipher their designated spot. To be placed at the king's right hand was the ultimate honor, signifying immense trust and favor. The further you were from the high table, the lower your social standing or current influence. It was a social X-ray, exposing the precise power dynamics of the court in real time. A slight shift in your usual seat could send ripples of gossip and speculation throughout the entire court for weeks. Did you see where Lord Edgar was placed tonight? 3 seats further from the king? What could it mean? A mainstream historical fact, the concept of a high table or dais upon which the king and his most honored guests sat, elevated above the main hall, was fundamental to medieval banqueting. This physical elevation mirrored the social and political elevation of the monarch, creating a clear visual distinction between ruler and ruled. The further down the hall, the less formal the setting, sometimes even with trestle tables that could be dismantled, emphasizing the temporary nature of the lower-ranked gatherings compared to the king's permanent, elevated status. Now, for a quirky tidbit sometimes, seating charts were so fluid that the king himself might occasionally rearrange them on the spot to send an immediate, pointed message. Imagine a slighted courtier suddenly being moved further away, or a newly favored ally being beckoned closer. These on-the-fly adjustments were masterstrokes of nonverbal communication, akin to a modern CEO publicly promoting someone or subtly demoting another right in the middle of a board meeting. These were public declarations of political favor or disfavor, enacted through the simple yet potent act of moving a chair. Historians still argue whether such spontaneous adjustments were truly spontaneous acts of kingly whim or pre-planned maneuvers designed to maximize their dramatic impact. You would also notice the symbolic significance of seating on different sides of the king. While the right hand was supreme, the left was also highly honored. However, seating near the entrances or exits, or in drafty corners, was typically reserved for those of lesser importance, or perhaps those who were simply out of favor. The physical discomfort of a poor seat subtly reinforced a social snub. It was an unspoken way of saying, you're not just out of the loop, you're also probably catching a chill. Even the type of seating varied. The king and queen would have grand, often throne-like chairs. High-ranking nobles might have chairs with backs, while those further down the table might sit on benches or stools. The very furniture you occupied was another subtle indicator of your societal weight. It's like being given a plush armchair versus a wobbly plastic stool at a corporate event. The message is clear without a single word being uttered. So, as you observe the precise arrangement of bodies around the royal table, remember that it is a living, breathing chart of power. Every person's placement, every vacant seat, every subtle shift is a carefully orchestrated message, defining relationships, revealing alliances, and broadcasting the king's favor or displeasure in a language understood by all who dwelled within the intricate web of the medieval court. As the intricate seating arrangements settle, silently broadcasting the court's pecking order, your attention is now drawn to a truly fascinating aspect of medieval diplomacy, the exchange of gifted foods. This was far more than a simple act of generosity. It was a potent language of pacts, promises, and veiled threats, where a carefully chosen goose or a barrel of wine could seal an alliance or avert a conflict. You are witnessing edible diplomacy in its rawest, most symbolic form. Imagine a visiting dignitary arriving with a procession carrying meticulously packed baskets and casks. These weren't just provisions for the journey. They were often elaborate culinary gifts for the host king. A gift of a particularly rare bird, perhaps a white gerfalcon, already dressed and prepared for the table, might signify respect and a desire for peaceful relations. Conversely, sending a meager or common offering could be a subtle, yet unmistakable slight, signaling disinterest or even contempt. It's like sending a box of stale donuts to your rival CEO when they were expecting a gourmet hamper. Definitely not a good sign for future collaborations. A mainstream historical fact, the exchange of gifts, including food items, was a deeply ingrained practice in medieval diplomacy and social interaction. These gifts served to establish and reinforce personal bonds, demonstrate wealth, and solidify treaties. A king might send a large quantity of his finest game to an ally, symbolizing shared bounty and mutual support. These were tangible expressions of political intent, often more eloquent than any written document. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some food gifts weren't just about luxury, but about practical, even strategic, alliances. For example, a king in a northern region might send barrels of preserved fish or special furs to a southern king in exchange for precious spices or fine wines. These exchanges formalized trade routes and economic dependencies, effectively binding kingdoms together through their appetites. It was a delicious form of geopolitical networking. Historians still argue whether the value of the food gifts exchanged genuinely reflected the strength of an alliance, or if it was sometimes a deceptive ploy to mask underlying tensions. You would also notice the reciprocal nature of these exchanges. A king receiving an impressive food gift would be expected to reciprocate with an offering of comparable or even greater value. Failure to do so could be interpreted as a sign of weakness, ingratitude, or an unwillingness to engage in the proposed alliance. The culinary arms race of gift-giving was a constant diplomatic dance, requiring careful calculation and a keen understanding of courtly protocol. Even the presentation of the gifted food carried weight. Was it presented openly, with pomp and ceremony, symbolizing transparency and goodwill, or was it delivered discreetly, perhaps hinting at a secret negotiation or a sensitive exchange? The manner of delivery could add another layer of nuance to the message, understood by all who were fluent in the silent language of medieval courtliness. You might see a beautifully decorated sugar sculpture depicting a scene of peace offered by a recently reconciled rival, a sweet gesture hinting at a fragile truce. So, as you observe the lavish procession of edible gifts, remember that these are not mere tokens. They are carefully crafted diplomatic communiques, carrying the weight of treaties, the promise of alliances, and the subtle declarations of friendship or animosity. In the medieval world, sometimes the most powerful messages weren't spoken in words, but tasted on the tongue, leaving the delicate dance of gifted foods. Your journey through the medieval court's culinary communication takes a stark turn. You now observe a dramatic juxtaposition that profoundly impacts the king's power and the messages his table conveys, the brutal realities of one famine and feast. In this unpredictable era, the abundance or scarcity of food didn't just affect daily life. It directly influenced royal legitimacy, stability, and the very perception of a monarch's capabilities. You are witnessing the raw, primal connection between a king's ability to feed his people and his right to rule them. Imagine a scene of vibrant, overflowing banquets during a prosperous harvest, then contrast it with the gaunt faces and empty tables during a severe famine. The king's ability to put food on his own table, and by extension, to ensure at least some sustenance for his populace, was seen as a direct reflection of divine favor and his competence as a ruler. A king who presided over widespread starvation risked not just popular discontent, but outright rebellion. As his subjects questioned his divine right and his ability to govern, it's like a modern government failing to provide basic utilities. It quickly erodes trust, but on a far more visceral, life or death scale. A mainstream historical fact, medieval Europe was highly susceptible to famine due to rudimentary agricultural techniques, reliance on local harvests, and unpredictable weather patterns. A series of bad harvests could quickly lead to widespread starvation, disease, and social unrest. Kings often struggled to manage these crises, and their failures were frequently interpreted as signs of divine displeasure or their own inadequacy, leading to challenges to their authority. The Great Famine of 1317, for instance, devastated populations and had long-lasting political repercussions across the continent. Now, for a quirky tidbit during times of severe scarcity, even the king might engage in public displays of frugality, eating simpler fare or donating large quantities of his own provisions to the poor, not just out of genuine charity, but as a calculated act of PR. This was a direct message of solidarity and an attempt to maintain legitimacy by demonstrating empathy with the suffering populace. It's the medieval equivalent of a politician eating a humble pie literally to show they understand the common person's struggles. Historians still argue whether these public displays were genuinely altruistic or primarily cynical attempts to manipulate public opinion and avert uprisings. You would notice how the very architecture of power shifted with the seasons of plenty and want. During a time of feast, the royal court would expand, filled with retainers, guests, and petitioners, all drawn by the promise of sustenance and opportunity. The king's largesse, symbolized by his overflowing table, attracted loyalty and reinforced his image as a generous provider. The halls would echo with laughter and merriment, a vibrant display of stable rule. Conversely, during famine, the court might shrink, nobles returning to their own estates to manage their dwindling resources. The king's ability to maintain even a semblance of a grand household would be tested. The atmosphere would be somber, hushed, reflecting the grim reality outside the castle walls. The very food on the royal table, even if it was still plentiful, might be consumed with a quiet solemnity, a stark contrast to the celebratory feasts. So, as you witness the profound impact of feast and famine, remember that the king's relationship with food wasn't just about personal sustenance, it was a direct, tangible link to his political stability, his divine mandate, and his very ability to hold on to power. The abundance or scarcity on his table mirrored the health of his kingdom, sending the clearest, most urgent messages of all. From the stark realities of famine and feast, your observation now turns to another powerful stage for culinary messaging. Religious feasts. Kikurum. In medieval Europe, where faith permeated every aspect of life, religious celebrations weren't merely spiritual observances. They were often skillfully co-opted by kings to reinforce their divine right, demonstrate piety, and subtly weave political messages into the sacred fabric of society. You are witnessing a feast where piety and politics are inextricably intertwined, seasoned with sacred symbolism. Imagine the lavishness of an Easter banquet, after the solemnity of Lent, or the joyous excess of a Christmas celebration. These were occasions of intense symbolism, where specific foods and rituals held deep religious significance. The king, by leading these feasts, positioned himself not just as a temporal ruler, but as a devout Christian monarch, blessed by God, and therefore rightful in his rule. His participation in and funding of these elaborate religious meals was a public performance of his faith, designed to secure popular support in divine legitimacy. It's like a modern head of state attending a high-profile religious service, but with more roasted peacocks and less awkward small talk. A mainstream historical fact, the church played a central role in medieval life, and kings often sought to align themselves closely with its authority. Religious holidays were mandatory observances, and the feasting that accompanied them, often after periods of fasting, like Lent, was deeply ingrained in the cultural calendar. Kings frequently used these occasions to display their reverence, offer charity, and gather their nobility, making them prime opportunities for political messaging under the guise of piety. Now, how for a quirky tidbit, certain foods consumed during religious feasts held specific theological meanings that could be subtly manipulated. For example, during Easter, a lamb wasn't just meat, it symbolized the Lamb of God. A king might commission an elaborate lamb dish, perhaps adorned with specific heraldry, subtly linking his lineage or recent victory to divine blessing. Similarly, special fish dishes during fast days, especially rare or exotic varieties, demonstrated not just piety, but also the king's wealth and ability to adhere to religious strictures while still dining sumptuously. Historians still argue whether the elaborate symbolism of these dishes was truly understood by the common populace or primarily appreciated by the more educated clergy and nobility. You would observe how the guest list for these feasts often included high-ranking clergy, abbots, and bishops, strengthening the king's ties to the church. The lavishness of the meal, the generosity of the king's offerings, and his public displays of devotion were all designed to curry favor with ecclesiastical powers, which wielded immense influence over the populace and rival nobles. A king who feasted devoutly was a king who commanded both earthly and spiritual respect. Even the rituals around these feasts, like the king personally serving a portion of food to the poor as an act of charity, were carefully choreographed. These acts of public humility and generosity reinforced his image as a compassionate ruler, divinely appointed and genuinely concerned for his subjects' welfare. It was a well-honed performance, a seamless blend of spiritual duty and political strategy. So, as you witness the solemnity and spectacle of these religious feasts, remember that they were far more than just celebrations of faith. They were carefully constructed platforms where kings solidified their power, demonstrated their piety, and wove intricate political messages into the very fabric of sacred tradition, ensuring that their rule was seen as both divinely sanctioned and unquestionably legitimate. Moving from the solemnity of religious feasts, your journey through the king's culinary messaging takes you outdoors, into the thrill and pageantry of the hunting feast. This wasn't just a celebratory meal after a successful hunt. It was a primal display of royal dominance, a theatrical performance of physical prowess, and a powerful reaffirmation of the king's control over his lands and, by extension, his people. You are witnessing a feast born of blood, sweat, and absolute authority. Imagine the king, fresh from the chase, perhaps still slightly disheveled, but undeniably triumphant, presiding over a makeshift banquet set up right in the heart of his hunting grounds. The centerpiece wouldn't be a delicacy imported from afar, but the very animals brought down during the day's exertion, a magnificent stag, a wild boar, or even a bear. The feast itself, prepared sometimes on open fires, emphasized a rustic, vigorous masculinity, contrasting with the more refined courtly banquets, but no less potent in its message. It's like a corporate retreat where the CEO not only closes the big deal, but also personally bags a trophy buck for dinner. A mainstream historical fact hunting was a highly ritualized and exclusive aristocratic pastime in medieval Europe, not merely for sport, but as a critical means of training for warfare and demonstrating martial skill. Royal forests were vast and protected, and commoners were strictly forbidden from hunting game within them. Therefore, a successful hunt and the subsequent feast were direct demonstrations of the king's physical prowess, his wealth in maintaining such preserves, and his absolute control over his domain. It was a visible manifestation of his ability to defend his kingdom and provide for his people. Now, for a quirky tidbit sometimes, the hunted animal itself would be paraded through the feasting area before being butchered and cooked, its size and ferocity serving as a testament to the king's courage and skill. Imagine a magnificent stag, freshly killed, being ceremonially presented to the king and his guests before it was transformed into a banquet. This direct, visceral display of conquest over nature amplified the king's perceived power. It's a bit macabre, perhaps, but undeniably effective. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of these grand hunting displays was genuinely about skill, or more about creating a powerful image of the monarch as a master of the wild. You would notice that the guests at a hunting feast were often those specifically invited to partake in the hunt itself: trusted nobles, military commanders, and favored companions. The shared experience of the chase and the communal feasting afterward fostered a sense of camaraderie and loyalty, strengthening bonds that were crucial for political stability. It was a form of team building, medieval style, but with significantly higher stakes and tastier outcomes. Even the types of dishes served reflected the raw, immediate nature of the event, less emphasis on elaborate subtleties and more on simple, large cuts of roasted game, perhaps seasoned minimally to highlight the freshness of the kill. This directness in presentation underscored the king's connection to the land and his ability to draw sustenance directly from his territory, without the need for complex trade networks. It was a message of self-sufficiency and robust vitality. So, as you observe the crackling fires and the hearty laughter of a medieval hunting feast, remember that this seemingly recreational event was a carefully crafted display of power. It showcased the king's physical strength, his control over nature and his domain, and his ability to command the loyalty of his most trusted men, all communicated through the succulent, freshly hunted meat on the table. Leaving the boisterous camaraderie of the hunting feast, your journey now takes a grim turn, forcing you to confront the inverse of plenty, the desperate, strategic role of food during a many siege. Here, food isn't a symbol of luxury or power. It's a weapon, a currency of survival, and the ultimate determinant of victory or defeat. You are observing how the presence, or agonizing absence, of sustenance decided the fate of entire strongholds and the legitimacy of their rulers. Imagine a castle under siege, its inhabitants slowly starving. Every scrap of grain, every last piece of dried meat becomes infinitely precious. The king or lord within, if he wished to maintain morale and avoid mutiny, had to manage his dwindling food supplies with meticulous care, rationing, and grim determination. The ability to endure a prolonged siege, sustained by whatever provisions remained or could be secretly smuggled in, was a powerful message of resilience and unwavering leadership. It's like a corporate takeover bid, but instead of cutting expenses, you're cutting rations, hoping your company can outlast the hostile bidder's resources. A mainstream historical fact. Logistics and provisioning were absolutely critical to medieval warfare, especially during sieges. Besieging armies had to ensure their own food supply, while simultaneously attempting to cut off the supply lines to the besieged fortress. The success or failure of a siege often hinged less on direct assault and more on who could outlast whom in terms of food and water. This made food not just a necessity, but a strategic tool of immense power. Now, for a quirky tidbit, desperation during a siege could lead to truly bizarre culinary practices. There are accounts of besieged garrisons eating anything from rats and cats to shoe leather, and even, in extreme cases, turning to cannibalism. While abhorrent, such grim acts were a testament to the absolute power of starvation to break a will. A king who somehow kept his garrison from resorting to such extremes, even under duress, projected an image of divine favor and superior planning. Historians still argue whether some of the more extreme tales of besieged diets were always entirely factual or sometimes exaggerated to emphasize the horrors of war. You would notice the psychological warfare waged with food. A besieging army might parade lavish meals outside the castle walls, their cooking fires sending tantalizing aromas into the starving fortress. A cruel psychological tactic designed to break the defender's will. Conversely, the besieged might defiantly throw their last scraps over the walls, pretending to have ample supplies, a desperate bluff to discourage the attackers. Every crumb, every wisp of smoke carried a message. Even the types of food stockpiled for a siege were specific dried grains, salted meats, preserved vegetables. These were not the fresh, celebratory dishes of a feast, but the grim, practical staples of survival. The foresight to amass such provisions and the discipline to ration them effectively were silent declarations of a ruler's strategic intelligence and his commitment to his people's survival. It was a testament to cold, hard planning, rather than flamboyant display. So, as you observe the stark reality of food in a siege, remember that it transcends mere sustenance. It becomes the ultimate test of leadership, morale, and strategic acumen. The availability, or lack thereof, of food in these dire circumstances sent the most urgent, life or death messages, often determining the very existence of a kingdom and its ruler. Emerging from the grim shadows of siege warfare, your perspective shifts to a more deliberate and public use of food's communicative power, its role as our propaganda. Medieval kings understood, long before modern advertising, that visual and sensory displays of food could powerfully shape public opinion, fostering loyalty, quelling discontent, and broadcasting an image of benevolence and strength. You are now observing the calculated art of edible public relations. Imagine a king making a grand entry into a newly conquered town, not with a show of arms, but with a procession of carts laden with loaves of fresh bread, barrels of ale, and roasted meats, distributed freely to the populace. This wasn't just charity, it was a potent act of bread and circuses, a direct message that the new ruler would provide for his people, bringing prosperity rather than hardship. Such a gesture immediately fostered goodwill and undermined any lingering resistance, appealing directly to the most basic human need. It's like a brand new mayor throwing a massive, free community barbecue on their first day. Very effective. A mainstream historical fact, medieval rulers frequently engaged in public displays of largesse, distributing food and drink to the masses, particularly during coronations, royal weddings, or times of celebration. These acts were carefully planned to generate popular support and demonstrate the monarch's generosity and capacity to provide for his subjects. The visual impact of overflowing provisions directly associated the king with prosperity and stability. Now, for a quirky tidbit sometimes, food used for propaganda wasn't consumed by the public but used as a spectacular display of waste and abundance. Accounts exist of entire rivers of wine flowing through city streets during celebrations, or mountains of food being piled up just to be looked at before being discarded. While seemingly profligate, this was a hyperbolic statement of limitless resources. Designed to overwhelm the senses and instill awe, it was a medieval equivalent of a money shower, saying, I have so much, I can literally waste it, and still have more than you. Historians still argue whether such extreme displays of waste were genuinely effective at garnering public approval or sometimes backfired by inciting resentment among the poor. You would notice the symbolic value of specific foods in these public displays. Bread, as the staff of life, was particularly powerful. The act of a king or queen personally handing out loaves to the poor carried immense weight, creating a direct, personal connection between the monarch and their most vulnerable subjects. This was a message of accessibility and care, designed to cultivate loyalty from the ground up. Even the scale of the distribution mattered. The more people fed, the more widespread the message of the king's beneficence. Word would spread quickly through towns and villages about the king who filled hungry bellies, cementing his image as a just and capable ruler. This was a rudimentary form of viral marketing, with very tangible, edible benefits. Consider the timing of these events. Often, they would coincide with periods of potential unrest or after a controversial decision. A public feast could deflect criticism, distract from grievances, and foster a sense of collective celebration that temporarily overshadowed discontent. It was a strategic deployment of gastronomic joy to soothe political anxieties. So, as you witness the spectacle of food being used to sway the hearts and minds of the medieval populace, remember that it's a sophisticated act of communication. Through generous distribution and opulent display, kings transform mere sustenance into powerful propaganda, shaping public opinion and cementing their reign with every shared bite and every flowing goblet. Having explored food as propaganda, your journey through medieval royal culinary communication now delves into the sheer artistry and innovation that went into crafting these edible messages. You turn your gaze to the visionary individuals who were the Hextascafier's ancestors. The master chefs and culinary artists whose ingenuity transformed simple ingredients into spectacular displays designed to awe, entertain, and subtly convey royal power. You are entering the realm of edible architecture and food as theatrical performance. Imagine a dish so elaborate it scarcely resembles food, perhaps a gelatin molded into a shimmering castle, complete with sugar flags and edible battlements. These were the subtleties we touched upon earlier, but the artistry went far beyond. Chefs would create intricate pasties, pies shaped like ships, animals, or even mythological creatures, often with the addition of mechanical elements that allowed them to move or breathe smoke. This wasn't just cooking, it was engineering, sculpture, and performance art, all rolled into one magnificent, albeit temporary, edible marvel. It's like commissioning a famous architect to design your gingerbread house, completely over the top, but undeniably impressive. A mainstream historical fact, medieval European courts witnessed a remarkable period of culinary innovation, particularly from the 13th to the 15th centuries. Influences from Arab cuisine, brought back by crusaders, introduced new ingredients and techniques like distillation and sugarwork, while growing trade brought exotic spices. This era saw the rise of professional chefs who were highly valued for their creativity and ability to produce dishes that not only tasted good, but also served as visual spectacles. The more sophisticated the court, the more elaborate its culinary creations. Now, for a quirky tidbit, one particularly bizarre, yet highly illustrative, culinary innovation was the practice of serving an animal redressed. This involves skinning a bird like a peacock or swan, cooking it, and then meticulously reattaching its feathers, sometimes even adding gilt to its beak and claws, so it appeared almost alive on the platter. This macabre yet stunning presentation was a powerful symbol of the chef's skill and the king's dominion over nature, effectively bringing the wild world into the elegant confines of the dining hall. It's a bit like having a taxidermied pet as your centerpiece, only slightly less permanent. Historians still argue whether the primary intention of these redressed animals was purely aesthetic, symbolic of the king's power, or perhaps a rather dark display of man's mastery over nature. You would notice the use of vibrant, often artificial color in these dishes. Chefs employed saffron for yellow, verdigris carefully, as it's toxic in large amounts for green, and various plant extracts for reds and blues. The goal was to create a visual feast, to make the food as eye-catching and fantastical as possible, reflecting the king's desire to amaze and delight his guests, and subtly, to demonstrate his wealth and access to rare, expensive pigments. It was the medieval equivalent of using highly saturated filters on your food photos. Even the transformation of ingredients held symbolic weight, turning humble flour and water into intricate pastries or mundane meat into a lifelike sautelti, showcased the power of human ingenuity and, by extension, the king's ability to inspire and command such talent. These culinary innovations were a direct reflection of the court's intellectual and artistic vibrancy. So, as you observe the remnants of these incredible culinary creations, remember that they were more than just meals. They were the product of visionary chefs, true artists of their time, who used food as a medium for grand statements. Through elaborate design, fantastical presentation, and daring innovation, they crafted edible spectacles that reinforced the king's prestige, entertained his court, and sent unspoken messages of power and sophistication. From the dazzling innovations of the royal chefs, your attention now shifts to the very documents that preserve their edible artistry and, in turn, offer invaluable insights into royal messaging, the early cookbooks. These weren't just recipe collections for the home cook. They were often compilations of courtly grandeur, functioning as repositories of culinary knowledge and, implicitly, as records of royal intent and social aspiration. You are now delving into the edible archives of power. Imagine poring over a medieval manuscript, its pages filled not just with ingredients and instructions, but with elaborate descriptions of how to prepare dishes fit for a king, often complete with illustrations of finished plates or carving techniques. These cookbooks, like the famous Le Viandier, or Form of Curry, compiled for royal households or high-ranking nobles, showcase the complexity and extravagance of courtly cuisine. They were manuals for culinary dominance, demonstrating the kind of feasts a truly powerful household could produce. It's like finding the secret playbook for a competitive eating contest, but where the prize isn't a trophy, it's political leverage. A mainstream historical fact, the earliest surviving European cookbooks, dating from the late 13th to 15th centuries, primarily served elite households. They reflect a growing sophistication in culinary practices and a desire to formalize and share these complex recipes. These texts provide direct evidence of the ingredients available, the cooking techniques employed, and the highly stylized presentations favored by the nobility, offering a window into the gastronomic culture of the ruling class. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some of these cookbooks contain not just recipes, but also advice on table etiquette, carving rituals, and even how to manage a kitchen staff of hundreds. They were comprehensive guides to running a noble household, effectively a medieval how-to manual for projecting power through one's dining practices. Imagine a chapter titled How to Impress Your Arch Rival with a Swan Pie. Entirely plausible in such a context. Historians still argue whether these cookbooks were primarily practical guides for actual cooking or aspirational texts designed to set a high, perhaps even unattainable in standard for noble dining. You would notice the emphasis on exotic and expensive ingredients listed in these recipes. Unicorn horn, while mythical, sometimes appeared as an ingredient or at least a concept for medicinal or symbolic purposes in more esoteric texts, showing the lengths to which chefs would go for rarity. The frequent inclusion of vast quantities of sugar, almonds, and saffron underscores their value, and the court's access to extensive trade networks. These ingredient lists were silent boast, detailing the king's economic reach across continents. Even the language used in these cookbooks could be highly formal, reflecting the elevated status of the intended audience and the seriousness with which courtly dining was approached. The precision of the instructions, even for dishes that seem simple to us, speaks to a desire for perfection and control, mirroring the king's desire for control over his realm. So, as you metaphorically leaf through the yellowed pages of these ancient culinary texts, remember that they are more than just dusty relics. They are blueprints for power, guides to gastronomic diplomacy, and enduring records of how medieval kings and nobles used food not just to feed their bodies, but to cement their authority and broadcast their immense influence to all who might read their culinary codes. From the curated wisdom of ancient cookbooks, your journey now plunges into the deepest anxieties of the medieval royal table, the ever-present specter of house poison panics. Here, food was not a symbol of power or plenty, but a potential vehicle for betrayal and death. The elaborate rituals surrounding the serving and tasting of meals reveal a profound paranoia that permeated the highest levels of medieval society. You are sensing the chilling undercurrent of fear that flowed beneath every lavish feast. Imagine the king, surrounded by his trusted courtiers, yet every bite, every sip, carries a silent, terrifying question. Is this safe? The threat of poisoning was a very real concern for medieval monarchs, a clandestine method of assassination that left no obvious trace of violence. The more powerful the ruler, the more enemies they likely accumulated, and the more vigilant they had to be. It's like being the CEO of a huge, competitive corporation, where every business lunch comes with a side of existential dread. A mainstream historical fact, historical accounts are replete with suspicions and accusations of poisoning. Even if concrete proof was often scarce, the lack of sophisticated forensic science meant that mysterious illnesses or sudden deaths among powerful figures were frequently attributed to poison. This pervasive fear led to elaborate precautions within royal households, making food safety not just a health issue, but a matter of state security. Now, for a quirky tidbit, the role of the taster monarchs or assayer was not just a formality, it was a deeply serious and often fatal position. This trusted servant would eat a portion of every dish and drink from every goblet before it was presented to the king. If the taster fell ill or died, the king would be warned. It was the ultimate job hazard, a testament to unwavering loyalty or desperate ambition. Imagine signing up for that role. Benefits include proximity to power, potential for rapid career advancement, and a higher chance of sudden, dramatic demise. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of tasters genuinely deterred poisoners or if it simply offered a psychological comfort to the paranoid monarch. As a determined poisoner could easily find ways around it. You would notice the elaborate rituals surrounding the serving of the king's food. Special cloths might be used to cover dishes during transport, and the carving of meat might be done under strict supervision, sometimes even by the king's most trusted knight. Every step, from kitchen to table, was designed to minimize opportunities for tampering. This hypervigilance transformed the act of dining into a tightly controlled security operation. Even the types of ingredients could be viewed with suspicion. Certain substances, known for their strong flavors, might be favored in sauces to mask any subtle, bitter taste of poison. Conversely, foods with mild flavors might be avoided, as they offered less cover for nefarious additions. The king's diet itself could become a strategic choice, influenced by fear. So, as you feel the subtle chill of medieval paranoia permeating the opulent dining hall, remember that the seemingly abundant feast was also a battleground of suspicion. The elaborate rituals, the trusted tasters, and the very choices of ingredients all spoke to a king's profound vulnerability and the ever-present fear that his next meal could be his last. Stepping away from the chilling reality of poison panics, your journey through the medieval king's use of food now takes you on the road. Observing the logistical ballet of the royal progresses, these were not merely leisurely tours, they were grand, mobile spectacles designed to assert authority, collect revenue, and foster loyalty across the kingdom, with food playing a crucial, communicative role at every stop. You are witnessing the king's power on the move, sustained and announced by his traveling larder. Imagine the sheer scale of a royal progress: hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, courtiers, guards, servants, scribes, and entertainers, all traveling with the king, feeding such a massive retinue, often on short notice in various towns and castles, was an immense logistical undertaking, a logistical marvel of its time. The king's ability to provision his entourage, even in remote areas, was a clear demonstration of his vast resources, his organizational prowess, and his unquestionable authority throughout his domain. It's like a massive rock concert tour, but instead of instruments and pyrotechnics, the main show is the ability to feed everyone. A mainstream historical fact: royal progresses were a common feature of medieval monarchy. Kings used them to personally visit their territories, administer justice, collect taxes, and remind local lords of their sovereign power. The local populace and nobility were expected to host the king and his retinue, which often placed an enormous financial burden on them, but also offered a chance to gain royal favor. The success of a progress often hinged on the ability to find and transport sufficient food. Now, for a quirky tidbit, the royal household would often send out forerunners. Days or weeks ahead of the main party, these individuals scouted out provisions, arranged lodging, and essentially prepped the route. They would assess local markets, negotiate prices, and ensure that enough bread, ale, meat, and other supplies were ready upon the king's arrival. Their efficiency directly impacted the king's comfort and the success of his display of power. It's like a highly advanced medieval catering and event planning service, but with more urgency and fewer spreadsheets. Historians still argue whether the imposition of hosting duties on local communities fostered loyalty or resentment. Given the immense cost and disruption, you would notice the visible impact of the king's arrival on the local food supply. Markets would swell with goods, bakers would work overtime, and local farmers would be called upon to provide provisions, often at fixed royal prices. The sudden influx of demand and the subsequent consumption of vast quantities of food were a clear signal of the king's presence and his ability to command the resources of any part of his realm. It was a visible surge in the economic activity, directly linked to royal power. Even the type of food served at each stop carried a message. If the king was particularly pleased with a local lord, he might permit a more lavish feast, perhaps even sharing some of his own exotic provisions. Conversely, a more austere meal might signal displeasure or simply the logistical limitations of a difficult journey. The meal wasn't just sustenance, it was a barometer of the relationship between the king and his hosts. So, as you travel alongside the king's mobile court, observing the bustling preparations and the consumption of vast amounts of provisions, remember that food was the silent engine of the royal progress. It sustained the king's power, announced his arrival, and solidified his authority, transforming the act of eating into a continuous, kingdom-wide declaration of sovereignty. Stepping off the dusty roads of a royal progress, your journey through the king's culinary lexicon brings you to a particularly poignant and powerful use of shared meals, feasts of reconciliation. These were not joyous celebrations of existing unity, but carefully orchestrated acts of dining designed to mend fractured relationships, quell rebellion, and bring former adversaries back into the fold. You are witnessing the delicate art of peacemaking, seasoned with diplomacy and served with a side of forgiveness. Imagine two powerful lords recently at odds, perhaps even on the brink of civil war, now seated at the same table, across from the king, sharing bread and wine. This act of communal eating, especially within the hallowed space of the royal dining hall, was a highly symbolic gesture. It signified a willingness to put aside animosity, to participate in a shared experience, and implicitly to acknowledge the king's overarching authority as the mediator of peace. It's like a tense corporate merger negotiation where the final agreement is sealed, not with handshakes, but with a forced, yet polite shared meal. A mainstream historical fact medieval society, with its complex web of feudal loyalties and frequent disputes, often saw feuding lords. Kings frequently acted as arbiters in these conflicts, and formal reconciliation ceremonies were crucial to restoring order. Sharing a meal was a common and powerful component of these ceremonies, signifying renewed trust and a public declaration of peace. It was a visible sign that the animosity was, at least for the moment, set aside. Now, for a quirky tidbit sometimes, the specific dishes served at a reconciliation feast held symbolic meaning related to the conflict or the desired outcome. For instance, a dish incorporating cleansing herbs might be served, or perhaps a food associated with purity or new beginnings. The very act of offering and accepting these dishes could be a subtle affirmation of the peace being brokered. It's like a dessert designed to taste like sweet victory. But for both sides, historians still argue whether the symbolism of these specific dishes was genuinely effective in fostering reconciliation or merely a theatrical embellishment for a peace already largely decided upon. You would notice the seating arrangements at such a feast were critical. The king would often sit between the formerly feuding parties, literally bridging the gap between them. The placement of their dishes, perhaps even the sharing of a common trencher from the king's own table, further reinforced the idea of renewed unity. The entire visual tableau was designed to communicate peace and harmony, even if the underlying tensions still simmered. The atmosphere, though perhaps initially stiff, would slowly be coaxed towards conviviality. Courtiers and musicians would work to lighten the mood, and the sheer abundance of delicious food and drink would encourage a sense of shared enjoyment. The goal was to transform a tense political gathering into a more relaxed social event, allowing for genuine conversation and the rebuilding of trust. So, as you witness the delicate diplomacy of these reconciliation feasts, remember that food was a silent, yet immensely powerful instrument for peace. Through shared meals, kings could mend broken alliances, pacify restless lords, and restore order to their realms, using the universal language of sustenance to bridge divides and foster a fragile, yet vital, unity. Leaving the delicate balance of reconciliation feasts, your attention shifts to the stark, demanding realities of food and warfare. Oh, in medieval times, a king's ability to wage a successful campaign hinged not just on courageous knights and strategic genius, but profoundly on the mundane, often overlooked, challenge of provisioning his army. Here, food transforms from a symbol of luxury into the gritty, essential fuel of conquest and defense. You are witnessing the crucial logistical backbone of medieval military power. Imagine thousands of soldiers, far from home, trudging through muddy terrain or hunkering down in makeshift camps. Their effectiveness, their morale, and indeed their very survival depended entirely on a consistent, reliable supply of food. A well-fed army was a strong, motivated army. A starving army was a ticking time bomb of desertion, disease, and mutiny. The king who could effectively feed his troops, even on long and arduous campaigns, demonstrated organizational mastery that rivaled any battlefield tactic. It's like a modern military operation where the victory depends as much on the supply chain manager as on the generals. A mainstream historical fact, the logistical challenges of feeding a medieval army were immense. Soldiers often foraged, but this was unreliable and could alienate local populations. Therefore, vast quantities of non-perishable staples like grain, dried meat, hardtack, and ale needed to be acquired, stored, and transported over long distances, often through hostile territory. This required extensive planning, significant financial resources, and a dedicated quartermaster corps. Failed logistics frequently led to failed campaigns, regardless of military prowess. Now, for a quirky tidbit to avoid relying solely on unreliable local foraging, some armies would bring along their own portable mills or even herds of livestock that could be slaughtered as needed. Imagine a medieval army camp with not just tents and weapons, but also a dedicated mobile abattoir and a team of bakers churning out fresh bread. This self-sufficiency, though resource-intensive, dramatically increased a king's operational range and strategic flexibility. Historians still argue whether the occasional use of live animals in transit was primarily for fresh meat or also served a psychological purpose, demoralizing the enemy by demonstrating overwhelming resources. You would notice the impact of food on troop morale. A hot meal after a long march, or a more substantial ration before a battle, could significantly boost fighting spirit. Conversely, a prolonged period of meager rations would lead to widespread grumbling, insubordination, and a sharp decline in combat effectiveness. The king's reputation as a leader was inextricably linked to his ability to keep his soldiers fed. A hungry army was a dangerous army, not just to the enemy, but potentially to its own commander. Even the type of food provided carried meaning. While not luxurious, providing consistently good quality staples, rather than rotten or meager provisions, was a direct message from the king to his soldiers. I care for your well-being. I value your service. This fostered loyalty and reduced the likelihood of desertion, crucial factors in sustained military success. It was a tangible investment in his human capital, literally putting his money where his army's mouth was. So, as you observe the relentless march of medieval armies and the logistical efforts to sustain them, remember that food was the silent, unsung hero of warfare. The strategic acquisition, careful management, and timely distribution of sustenance were paramount. A king's mastery over his larder was as crucial as his command of the battlefield, determining not just the outcome of battles, but the very fate of kingdoms. Shifting from the harsh, practical demands of military provisioning, your journey through medieval food's hidden messages now drifts into the more ethereal realm of courtly love and culinary gestures. In the intricate, often performative, dance of medieval romance, food could be a silent language of affection, a whispered overture, or even a discreet, coded message between lovers. You are observing how even the most romantic of gestures could be seasoned with subtle, edible symbolism. Imagine a knight, smitten with a lady of the court, commissioning a specialized sweetmeat or a delicate pastry to be presented to her at a feast. This wasn't just a polite offering, it was a highly personal message, crafted to convey admiration, desire, or even a secret plea. The choice of ingredients, perhaps expensive sugar for sweetness or rare spices for passion, could be imbued with specific romantic connotations, understood by those fluent in the subtle language of courtly exchange. It's like sending a carefully curated playlist to your crush, but instead of songs, it's highly perishable, elaborately shaped desserts. A mainstream historical fact, the concept of courtly love was a highly stylized and idealized form of romance that flourished in medieval noble courts, particularly from the 12th century onwards. It often involved a knight's devotion to a married lady of higher social standing, expressed through acts of service, poetry, and symbolic gestures. While often unconsummated, it provided a framework for social interaction and artistic expression within the aristocracy. Now, for a quirky tidbit, certain foods were believed to have aphrodisiac properties. In the medieval period, and their inclusion in a dish offered to a beloved could be a very direct, albeit discreet, romantic overture. Think of spices like ginger and cinnamon, or certain rich meats and eggs. Offering such a dish was a bolder statement than simply a pretty flower, a culinary nudge towards something more intimate. Historians still argue whether the perceived aphrodisiac qualities were genuinely believed by everyone, or if they were largely a playful, symbolic element within the rituals of courtly love. You would notice the emphasis on aesthetic beauty in these romantic culinary gifts. A meticulously crafted sugar sculpture, a gilded fruit, or a pastry dyed in a vibrant, alluring color would speak volumes. The effort and expense poured into such a gift were a testament to the giver's devotion and his ability to command the resources necessary for such an extravagant display of affection. It was an art form where the medium was edible and the message was heartfelt, or at least strategically intended to appear so. Even the act of sharing food, especially from the same trencher or cup, could carry profound romantic implications. While common in general dining, if done with specific intent between a knight and a lady, it could signify a deepening bond, a shared intimacy beyond the public gaze. It was a subtle violation of social distance, a silent crossing of boundaries that spoke louder than any whispered word. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from the introduction? Thankfully, no romantic gestures involve that. So, as you observe the delicate dance of medieval courtship, remember that food, beyond its role in power and politics, also served as a tender, silent language of the heart through carefully chosen ingredients, artistic presentations, and subtle shared moments. Medieval lovers used culinary gestures to express their affections, adding a delicious layer of intrigue to the complex tapestry of courtly life. From the subtle whispers of courtly love, your journey through the medieval dining hall now takes a more light-hearted, yet surprisingly insightful detour into the realm of the Jush Journey's Turnwank. These weren't just random bits of buffoonery. Often, the humor employed by the court jester, particularly when related to food, offered a unique, often subversive, form of communication. Through their clever wordplay and physical comedy, jesters could subtly critique power, highlight societal absurdities, and even deliver veiled messages that no one else dared to utter. You are witnessing the power of humor, seasoned with a dash of edible truth. Imagine the king, tired after a long day of ruling, watching a jester cavort. The jester might tell a tale of a gluttonous baron whose stomach was so vast, it required its own separate table, subtly mocking excess. Or perhaps he'd mime a servant dropping the king's prized pigeon pie, prompting nervous laughter and a gentle reminder of human fallibility. Even in royal service, these were not direct insults, but carefully crafted barbs, wrapped in humor, allowing uncomfortable truths to be aired without direct reprisal. It's like a late-night talk show host gently roasting politicians, but with a real risk of losing your head. A mainstream historical fact, medieval jesters, also known as fools, were often highly intelligent individuals, skilled in wit, music, and performance. Their unique position allowed them a degree of license unavailable to others, permitting them to speak truths to power that might otherwise be dangerous. They served as entertainers, but also as informal advisors, moral commentators, and sometimes even as disguised messengers. Now, for a quirky tidbit, jesters often used food-related puns or literal props as made from food to deliver their jokes. Imagine a jester wearing a hat made of stale bread, lamenting the dry times in the kingdom, hinting at economic hardship. Or perhaps he'd juggle apples and suddenly accidentally drop one, equating it to a royal misstep. These tangible, edible props made their humor immediate and relatable to an audience whose lives revolved around food. Historians still argue whether the jester's comedic criticisms genuinely influenced royal policy, or if they primarily served as a pressure release valve for courtly tensions. You would notice the audience's reaction, a crucial part of the jester's performance. A nervous titter might signal a joke that hit a little too close to home, while uproarious laughter suggested a safely delivered, universally appreciated jest. The king's own reaction was paramount. His amusement signaled acceptance, allowing the jester to continue his subversive commentary. A stone face, however, would be a clear warning to change the subject. Even the jester's own eating habits could be part of the act. He might ostentatiously devour a meager meal, exaggeratedly complaining about its blandness, while casting longing glances at the king's lavish spread, thereby highlighting the disparity in wealth in a humorous, non-threatening way. It was a subtle form of social commentary, disguised as slapstick. So, as you hear the echoes of laughter in the medieval hall, remember that the jester's food-centric jokes were more than just entertainment. They were a unique form of communication, a safe space for subtle criticism, and a means by which uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and even food scarcity could be gently, yet effectively, placed on the royal table for consumption, both literal and metaphorical. From the sharp wit of the jester, your attention now shifts to a less glamorous, yet remarkably telling, aspect of the medieval feast's communicative power. The aftermath, specifically, the leftovers and their relation to legitimacy. For a king, even the discarded food, the scraps and remnants of a grand banquet, could convey subtle messages about his generosity, his wealth, and his very right to rule. You are observing the unspoken narrative of abundance, even in its absence. Imagine the tables cleared, the guests departed, but a significant quantity of food remains. This wasn't merely waste, it was a deliberate or calculated excess. A king who consistently hosted feasts with abundant leftovers demonstrated his immense wealth and inexhaustible resources. It was a tangible proof of his capacity to provide, not just for his immediate court, but to share his bounty with those below him. This excess legitimized his power by reinforcing his image as a generous and capable provider. It's like a successful business holding a massive, opulent launch party and then publicly donating the remaining lavish catering to charity. A very visible display of we have so much, we can afford to give it away. A mainstream historical fact, large quantities of leftover food from royal and noble tables were routinely distributed to the poor, the household staff, or given to beggars gathered outside the castle gates. This practice, known as almsgiving, was a common form of charity, but it also served a practical purpose: waste disposal, and a symbolic one. It demonstrated the Lord's piety and generosity, reinforcing his social standing and moral authority. Now, for a quirky tidbit sometimes, the type of leftover food distributed could carry a specific message. Giving away fine white bread or choice cuts of roasted meat, rather than just the scraps, was a far grander gesture, designed to impress and foster deeper loyalty. It was a strategic choice in generosity, indicating not just abundance, but a willingness to share the very best. Imagine being a starving peasant and receiving a piece of the king's actual venison. It would create a powerful emotional bond. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for these generous handouts was genuine compassion or the strategic reinforcement of social hierarchies and control. You would also notice the contrast between the royal leftovers and the typical fare of the common people. The sheer difference in quality and quantity, even in discarded form, highlighted the vast chasm between the king's abundant life and the daily struggles of his subjects. This stark comparison, rather than inciting resentment, was often intended to reinforce the king's elevated, almost divinely ordained status as the ultimate provider. The very absence of leftovers, or particularly meager ones, could also send a message, though usually an unintended and negative one. It might signal financial difficulties, poor management, or even a lack of generosity, potentially undermining the king's image. A consistently barren table, even after a feast, would be a quiet alarm bell, indicating a weakening of royal power. So, as you observe the cleared tables and the subsequent distribution of remnants, remember that even in its ending, the royal feast continued to communicate. The abundance of leftovers and the manner of their dispersal silently affirmed the king's wealth, generosity, and his crucial role as the provider for his kingdom, solidifying his reign through the very act of sharing, even what remained. From the practical implications of leftovers, your journey through medieval food's profound influence now takes you to the very stage upon which these edible dramas unfolded: the architectural dining spaces. Far from being mere rooms for eating, medieval banquet halls were meticulously designed to enhance the message of the feast, turning the very structure into a silent, imposing declaration of royal power, prestige, and permanence. You are stepping into a realm where stone and timber amplify the monarch's might. Imagine entering a vast, cavernous hall, its high ceilings disappearing into shadow, supported by massive timber beams or grand stone arches. Light streams in through stained glass windows, perhaps depicting scenes of royal heraldry or heroic deeds. The sheer scale of such a space immediately communicated the king's boundless resources and his ambition. To build and maintain such a structure required immense wealth, countless laborers, and sophisticated architectural knowledge, all commanded by the monarch. It's like walking into a modern-day skyscraper and immediately understanding the financial power of the company that built it, but with less glass and more gargoyles. A mainstream historical fact, the Great Hall was the focal point of medieval castles and palaces, serving as the primary space for feasting, receiving guests, and conducting court business. These halls were often designed with specific features to accommodate large gatherings and emphasize the lord's status, such as a raised dais at one end for the high table and a minstrel's gallery for musicians and entertainers. Their grandeur was a direct reflection of the power of the resident lord. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some banquet halls featured elaborate fireplaces, so large that several oxen could be roasted simultaneously, or even entire kitchens could be built within their recesses. These massive hearths weren't just for warmth. They were dramatic symbols of the king's ability to provide immense quantities of roasted meat, a constant, flickering reminder of his limitless larder and hospitality. Imagine the roaring fire, illuminating the faces of hundreds, all warmed by the king's hearth, a powerful, primal connection. Historians still argue whether the extreme size of some medieval fireplaces was purely functional or also intended as an exaggerated display of culinary capacity and wealth. You would notice the strategic placement of the king's dais, elevated often by several steps. It set the monarch physically above his subjects, reinforcing his superior status and divine right to rule. From this vantage point, the king could survey his entire court, a visual reminder of his watchful eye and supreme authority. Every line of sight, every architectural flourish, was designed to direct attention and reverence towards the monarch. Even the acoustics of the hall played a subtle role. High ceilings and stone walls could create a resonant, sometimes echoing in space. While perhaps not ideal for intimate conversations, this grand echo amplified the sounds of the feast, the clatter of dishes, the murmur of voices, the music creating an immersive, overwhelming sensory experience designed to impress and perhaps even slightly disorient, ensuring the king's presence was undeniably felt. So, as you stand within these magnificent dining spaces, remember that they were not passive backdrops. They were active participants in the king's communication strategy, their very design reinforcing his power, prestige, and permanent place at the apex of medieval society. Stone, wood, and light all conspired to elevate the feast and the monarch to a truly majestic level. Having explored the grandeur of the dining halls, your journey now takes a less savory turn, exposing a hidden, darker side of medieval food practices. Food adulteration. Here, the message wasn't about royal power or lavish display, but about deceit, economic manipulation, and the often risky reality of what actually ended up on a plate, even a royal one. You are uncovering the ancient art of culinary fraud and its surprisingly far-reaching implications. Imagine a baker, desperate to stretch his expensive wheat flour, mixing in cheaper, coarser grains, or even sawdust to increase his profits. Or a wine merchant diluting his vintage with water, perhaps adding lead sugar for sweetness, a rather nasty practice. These weren't isolated incidents. Food adulteration was a widespread problem throughout the medieval period, from the humble market stall to, occasionally, the king's very own table. The message here was one of greed and deception, undermining trust and potentially impacting health. It's like discovering your organic kale is actually grown with industrial chemicals, a betrayal of implied quality. A mainstream historical fact, medieval authorities, including kings, were well aware of food adulteration and enacted laws to try and prevent it. Bakers caught selling underweight loaves or adulterated bread faced severe penalties, including public shaming being put in the pillory or even fines that crippled their businesses. This indicates the seriousness with which authorities viewed the purity of basic foodstuffs, especially those vital to the common populace. Now, for a quirky tidbit, certain colors were particularly susceptible to adulteration. For instance, the vibrant red of saffron, a highly prized and expensive spice, was often faked or mixed with cheaper, less potent dyes. A chef, eager to cut costs or impress without spending, might unwittingly or knowingly use an adulterated ingredient, subtly altering the message of wealth the king intended to send. Imagine a king thinking he's flaunting pure, expensive saffron, when in reality, it's glorified turmeric, a quiet, embarrassing culinary lie. Historians still argue whether the frequency of food adulteration stemmed from genuine scarcity, rampant greed, or simply a lack of effective regulatory oversight in a complex supply chain. You would notice the constant vigilance required even at the royal table. While tasters primarily guarded against poison, a sharp eye or a discerning palate could detect gross adulteration, a change in the texture of bread, a strange taste in wine, or an off-color sauce might indicate that corners had been cut somewhere along the supply chain. This meant that the king and his household had to rely on a complex network of trustworthy suppliers and diligent staff. Even the sourcing of food could carry a message about its authenticity. Food from the king's own domain, raised or grown under his direct supervision, would be seen as more reliable and unadulterated than goods bought from distant, unknown merchants. This preference subtly communicated a message of self-sufficiency and control over his own resources, mitigating the risk of being sold inferior or tainted products. So, as you uncover the less glamorous truth of medieval food, remember that behind the grand feasts and symbolic gestures lay a constant battle against deceit. Food adulteration was a pervasive challenge, subtly undermining messages of wealth and purity, and reminding even the most powerful monarch that their control, much like their dinner, could sometimes be less than perfectly genuine. From the deceptive world of adulterated foods, your attention now turns to a fundamental aspect of royal power that predates the plate, the king's patronage of agriculture and control over supply. This wasn't merely about owning land. It was about actively shaping the very source of sustenance, ensuring an abundant flow of food, and thereby demonstrating a deep, tangible command over the lifeblood of the kingdom. You are witnessing the king's power rooted in the fertile earth itself. Imagine a king investing heavily in draining marshes to create new arable land, or introducing new farming techniques like crop rotation to boost yields. These actions were not just good governance. They were direct messages to his populace and to rival monarchs. A king who ensured plentiful harvests and a stable food supply projected an image of divine favor, economic foresight, and a profound commitment to the well-being of his subjects. It's like a modern tech magnate investing in sustainable food systems. It's about control, but also about projecting an image of future-oriented leadership. A mainstream historical fact, medieval European monarchs derived much of their wealth and power from land ownership. By controlling vast estates, they directly influenced agricultural production, either through their own domain farms or through the feudal system where tenants owed them a portion of their produce. A king's ability to provision his court and army and to alleviate famine was directly tied to the productivity of his lands and his effective management of agricultural resources. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some kings were known to actively promote specific crops or livestock breeds, sometimes even distributing seeds or animals to their tenants. This wasn't just agricultural advice. It was a subtle form of economic control and a long-term investment in the kingdom's food security. A monarch who encouraged the cultivation of a particularly robust grain or the breeding of sturdier cattle was effectively strengthening his own power base and providing a tangible benefit to his people, all while silently broadcasting his care and foresight. Historians still argue whether royal agricultural patronage was driven primarily by economic self-interest, genuine concern for subjects, or strategic military considerations to ensure food for armies. You would notice the visible signs of agricultural prosperity under a strong king thriving markets, well-tended fields, and healthy livestock. These were indicators of a stable realm and a capable ruler. Conversely, neglected lands, struggling harvests, and widespread hunger would reflect poorly on the king, suggesting weakness or mismanagement. The very landscape and its ability to produce food became a silent commentary on the king's effectiveness. Even the granaries and storehouses within the royal castles conveyed a message. Their size and the sheer quantity of preserved provisions they held were a physical manifestation of the king's foresight and his capacity to weather lean times. These weren't just storage facilities. They were silent vaults of power, ensuring the king's ability to feed his court and army, even if external supplies failed. So, as you observe the vital link between the king and the very earth that nourished his kingdom, remember that his patronage of agriculture was a profound act of communication. By controlling and cultivating the source of food, he cemented his authority, demonstrated his foresight, and ensured the stability of his realm, proving that true power often begins not at the banquet table, but in the fields that produce its bounty. As our long journey through the secret language of medieval food nears its end, from the elaborate banquets to the very fields that nourish them, we arrive at the legacy of the royal table. You now see how these ancient culinary codes, the silent messages communicated through every dish, every sip, and every seating arrangement, still echo in the diplomatic practices and social rituals of our modern world. The past, in its edible wisdom, continues to inform the present. Imagine a modern state dinner, perhaps at the White House or Buckingham Palace. While the specific dishes and customs have evolved, the underlying principles of using food as a tool for diplomacy, status, and communication remain strikingly similar. The careful choice of menu, often highlighting national produce or culinary traditions, subtly broadcasts national pride and economic strength. The seating arrangement, though less overtly hierarchical than medieval times, still places key figures strategically to foster dialogue and convey honor. It's a softer, gentler echo of the medieval feast, but the core function is undeniably present. A mainstream historical fact, the concept of formal state dinners, where food and hospitality are used to conduct international relations, has roots stretching back centuries, with medieval royal banquets being key precursors. These gatherings continue to serve as opportunities for leaders to build personal relationships, negotiate agreements, and showcase their nation's culture and prosperity in a non-confrontational setting. Now, for a quirky tidbit even today, certain food-related superstitions or diplomatic faux pas can cause ripples. Imagine a head of state unknowingly serving a dish to a guest that is considered taboo in their culture, or making a meat versus vegetable choice that inadvertently sends a negative political message. While perhaps not as life-threatening as a poisoned medieval goblet, such culinary missteps can still lead to awkward diplomatic incidents, proving that food's communicative power, even in its most subtle forms, persists. Historians still argue whether the continuity of these food-related diplomatic practices is a conscious inheritance or simply a natural evolution of human social interaction. You would notice how the idea of warnas, hospitality, itself deeply embedded in medieval feasting, continues to be a cornerstone of modern diplomacy. To host a dignitary well, to provide a lavish and welcoming meal, is still a powerful gesture of respect and a means of building trust. The shared act of breaking bread, even across cultural divides, retains a primal resonance, fostering connection where words might fail. Even the presentation of food in high-end restaurants, with their emphasis on visual artistry and unique ingredients, mirrors the medieval royal chef's pursuit of the subtlety. The desire to awe and impress through culinary creativity is a timeless human impulse, perhaps a subconscious longing for the grand spectacles of bygone eras. So, as you reflect on the intricate layers of meaning woven into every bite of a medieval royal feast, realize that these aren't just quaint historical curiosities. They are the foundations of a universal language, a silent, edible code that has shaped power, negotiated peace, and declared status for centuries. The clinking of medieval goblets and the grand displays of roasted meats whisper lessons that still resonate today, proving that, when it comes to human communication, sometimes the most profound messages are delivered on a silver platter. Our journey through the hidden language of medieval royal feasting draws to a close. As the last echoes of the courtly banquet fade, imagine the soft glow of a dying hearth, casting long, peaceful shadows across the stone floor. The heavy scent of roasted meats and exotic spices gives way to the clean, cool air of the approaching night. You feel a gentle calm settle over you, a quiet stillness as the images of grand halls and silent messages recede. The world of kings and queens, of subtle power and edible diplomacy, drifts away like wisps of smoke from an ancient kitchen. Let the details of hidden meanings, the clever culinary codes, and the quiet historical echoes simply melt into the comfort of your thoughts. There's nothing more to decipher, no more grand pronouncements to understand, just the quiet hum of history settling softly around you. Close your eyes now, and let these whispered tales of medieval meals guide you into a restful, peaceful sleep. Sweet dreams.